What if the most prosperous civilization of the ancient world vanished overnight, leaving behind shattered palaces, empty streets, and a mystery that still haunts scholars? In the late 13th century BC, the Bronze Age civilization that stretched from the hills of Anatolia to the sands of Egypt imploded in a cascade of wars, famines, and migrations that reshaped the Mediterranean forever. The story begins in the heart of the Hittite Empire, where King Suppiluliuma II presided over a kingdom that once rivaled Egypt in wealth and military might. By 1200 BC, his capital Hadusa lay in ruins, its walls toppled by fire, its archives of cuneiform tablets scattered like ash, marking the first visible crack in a system that had thrived for 3 centuries. To understand the collapse, one must first grasp the interdependence of the late Bronze Age powers. The Hittites, Mycenae and Greeks, Egyptian New Kingdom, and the Levantine city-states of Ugarit and Byblos formed a complex trade network that moved tin from Central Asia, copper from Cyprus, and luxury goods across the eastern Mediterranean. This network was underpinned by a shared diplomatic language of clay tablets, sealed with cylinder seals, and a system of royal marriages that linked the courts of Ramses III, the last great Egyptian pharaoh, to the daughters of the Hittite king. By the mid-1200s BC, the flow of tin, essential for making bronze, accounted for nearly 30% of the empire's tax revenue, while grain shipments from the Levant supplied Egypt's armies. The fragility of this web meant that any disruption could ripple across the entire region. Around 1250 BC, the Sea Peoples first appear in Egyptian records, described as foreigners from the sea who attacked the Egyptian coastlines with swift galleys and fierce warriors. Their origins remain debated, but archaeological evidence points to a convergence of displaced peoples from the Aegean, Western Anatolia, and perhaps even the central Mediterranean. In the inscriptions of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, the pharaoh claims to have repelled a massive invasion of 40,000 warriors, a battle that cost Egypt 200 of its own soldiers and forced the king to divert resources from his building projects to fortify the delta. The Sea Peoples' raids coincided with the sudden abandonment of Mycenaean palace centers such as Pylos, Thebes, and Knossos, where archaeologists have uncovered layers of ash and collapsed walls dated precisely to 1190–1185 BC using dendrochronology. The loss of these administrative hubs crippled the Mycenaean elite's ability to collect tribute, leading to a rapid decline in the production of bronze weapons and the disappearance of Linear B script from the archaeological record. Simultaneously, climate data extracted from ice cores in the Alps and speleothems in the Levant reveal a sharp downturn in precipitation beginning around 1240 BC, lasting for roughly 3 decades. Tree ring analysis shows a 15% drop in growth rates across Anatolia, while pollen samples from the eastern Mediterranean indicate a shift from olive and grape cultivation to drought-tolerant cereals. This late Bronze Age drought would have slashed agricultural yields, starving both urban populations and the armies that depended on regular grain shipments. In the Hittite heartland, grain storage pits that once held up to 30,000 tons of wheat fell empty, forcing the royal court to requisition food from peripheral regions, a policy that sparked rebellion among vassal states such as Kizzuwatna and Arzawa. The internal stresses of famine and political unrest were amplified by a series of seismic events documented in both textual and geological sources. The Hittite annals record a massive earthquake in 1199 BC that leveled the fortress of Carchemish, while the Egyptian Great Storm of 1175 BC, described in the Tempest Stela, reports a sudden tidal surge that destroyed the harbor of Avaris. Modern seismologists estimate that the eastern Mediterranean experienced at least 4 magnitude 7 earthquakes within a 50-year span, each capable of triggering landslides that blocked trade routes, through the Taurus Mountains and the Syrian Plateau. The combined effect of these natural disasters was a cascading failure of supply lines that left cities isolated and vulnerable to external attack. Against this backdrop of famine, drought, and seismic upheaval, the Hittite Empire finally crumbled in 1180 BC when its capital Hattusa was sacked by an unknown coalition of insurgents and possibly sea peoples. The destruction layer contains a mixture of Mycenaean pottery, Cypriot copper ingots, and Egyptian scarabs, suggesting that the attackers were a heterogeneous force drawn from across the eastern Mediterranean. The loss of Hattusa eliminated the central administrative hub that coordinated tribute, military logistics, and diplomatic correspondence, causing peripheral territories to act independently and further destabilizing the region. In Egypt, the New Kingdom's golden age faltered under the weight of its own overextension. Ramses Roman III mortuary temple at Medinet Habu records a massive labor strike by workers from Deir el-Medina, who refused to build the pharaoh's tomb until they received promised rations, a rare glimpse of social unrest in a society traditionally portrayed as monolithic. By 1150 BC, the Egyptian fleet that once patrolled the eastern Mediterranean was reduced to a handful of ships, unable to protect its trade partners from piracy. The subsequent loss of Egyptian grain imports from the Levant forced the pharaoh to impose grain levies on the Nile's floodplain, a policy that led to a series of famines documented in the famine stela of the 22nd dynasty, where the Nile's inundation fell 30% below average for 3 consecutive years. The Levantine city-states, once thriving hubs of commerce, suffered the most abrupt decline. Ugarit, a coastal kingdom that had maintained a sophisticated alphabetic script and an extensive network of merchant vessels, was completely destroyed around 1190 BC. Archaeologists have uncovered a single, well-preserved archive of clay tablets in the palace's western wing, sealed in a layer of ash that matches the radiocarbon dates of the Hittite collapse. The tablets reveal that Ugarit's last king, Amurapi, sent desperate pleas for aid to the Egyptian court, only to receive a terse reply citing internal strife. By 1185 BC, Byblos and Sidon were reduced to modest fishing villages, their harbors clogged with shipwrecks and their civic buildings left unfinished. The sudden depopulation of these ports erased the maritime trade routes that had linked the Bronze Age world, forcing inland communities to rely on overland caravans that were slower and more vulnerable to banditry. In the western Mediterranean, the collapse manifested as a shift from palatial economies to localized agrarian societies. The Cycladic Islands, once integrated into a trade network that exported obsidian and pottery, show a marked decline in the production of high-status ceramics after 1200 BC. Excavations on Crete reveal that the Palace of Knossos was abandoned around 1195 BC, its storerooms emptied of amphorae and its frescoes left unfinished. The disappearance of centralized authority led to the rise of small chiefdoms, each controlling a few hundred hectares of arable land, a pattern that would define the Iron Age societies of the Aegean for the next 3 centuries. Transition from bronze to iron was not a smooth technological upgrade, but a forced adaptation to scarcity. Iron ore deposits in Anatolia and the Levant, previously deemed unsuitable for large-scale weapon production, became the primary source of metal after tin imports dried up. Metallurgical analysis of swords from the early Iron Age shows a higher carbon content, indicating that smiths experimented with carburization techniques to compensate for iron's lower hardness compared to bronze. By 1100 BC, iron weapons accounted for roughly 60% of the armaments found in burial sites across the eastern Mediterranean, a rapid shift that underscores how necessity drove innovation amid collapse. The demographic impact was equally stark. Population estimates derived from settlement sizes suggest that the Mediterranean region lost up to 20% of its inhabitants between 1250 and 1100 BC. Skeletal remains from Tel El Dabba in the Nile Delta show a rise in malnutrition markers, such as enamel hypoplasia, coinciding with the period of reduced grain imports. In the Hittite highlands, burial pits reveal a surge in adolescent deaths, likely caused by disease outbreaks that spread along refugee routes. These patterns indicate that the collapse was not merely a political upheaval, but a comprehensive societal crisis that affected health, nutrition, and mortality across all social strata. As the old powers waned, new groups seized the opportunity to expand. The Philistines, identified archaeologically by their distinct Mycenaean-style pottery and later by biblical texts, settled along the southern coast of Canaan around 1175 BC, establishing 5 city-states, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, that would become a dominant force in the early Iron Age. Their arrival is marked by a sudden appearance of distinctive bichrome ceramics and an increase in fortified hilltop settlements, suggesting a militarized migration into a power vacuum left by the fallen city-states. Simultaneously, the Assyrian kingdom in northern Mesopotamia, which had survived the initial shock due to its inland position, began a resurgence under kings such as Tiglath-Pileser I, who launched campaigns into former Hittite territories, absorbing their remnants and laying the groundwork for the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The cultural aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse reshaped religious and artistic expression. In the ruins of Mycenae, fresco fragments depicting a previously unknown deity, later identified as a possible syncretism of a sea god and a storm figure, suggest a shift toward more localized, protective cults in response to widespread insecurity. In Egypt, the decline of foreign tribute led to a revival of the cult of Amun-Ra, as evidenced by an increase in temple construction in Thebes after 1150 BC, a move that reinforced internal cohesion at the expense of external diplomatic outreach. The disappearance of linear B script and the rise of alphabetic scripts in the Levant illustrate a broader move towards simpler, more adaptable writing systems that could survive in fragmented societies. Economic reorganization followed the political realignment. Trade in copper, once dominated by Cypriot merchants, who controlled over 70% of Mediterranean copper production, fragmented into smaller regional exchanges. Excavations at Alatia, modern-day Cyprus, show a sharp decline in the volume of copper ingots exported after 1190 BC, replaced by locally produced bronze artifacts in inland Anatolia. The shift forced communities to rely more heavily on agricultural surplus and less on luxury goods, a transition reflected in the increased prevalence of plain pottery and the decline of elaborate goldsmithing in burial assemblages. The legacy of the collapse endured for centuries, influencing later historical narratives. Classical writers, such as Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus, referred to the Great Famine that struck the eastern Mediterranean, while biblical texts allude to the days of the judges, when tribal leaders rose in the absence of a centralized monarch. Modern scholars, using a combination of textual analysis, radiocarbon dating, and climate modeling, now view the Bronze Age collapse as a complex, multi-causal phenomenon, a perfect storm of environmental stress, technological failure, and human migration that precipitated the end of an era. Today, satellite imagery reveals the outlines of ancient field systems still visible in the Anatolian plateau, a silent testament to the agricultural foundations that once fed empires. Underwater archaeology off the coast of Turkey has uncovered wrecks laden with Cypriot copper, confirming that maritime trade continued in a reduced form even after the palaces fell. These discoveries underscore that, while the Bronze Age kingdoms vanished, the people who lived through the cataclysm adapted, survived, and laid the groundwork for the Iron Age civilizations that would eventually dominate the Mediterranean. The Bronze Age collapse was not a singular catastrophe, but a cascade of interconnected failures that reshaped the ancient world. From the fire-swept ruins of Hattusa to the deserted streets of Ugarit, from the desperate pleas of Egyptian laborers to the forged iron swords of emergent chiefdoms, each fragment of evidence tells a story of resilience amid ruin. In contemplating the sudden silence that fell over a world once defined by bronze, one is reminded that the rise and fall of civilizations often hinge on the delicate balance between nature's whims and humanity's response. The Mediterranean apocalypse of the late 13th century BC stands as a profound lesson. When the threads that bind societies are strained beyond breaking, even the mightiest empires can dissolve into dust.